This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 354, opensource.com. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about opensource.com with AmyJune Hineline. AmyJune is an Aaron Winborn Award winner. She is also the Senior Community Manager for opensource.com at Red Hat. She works in the Drupal contribution space as a mentor, initiative lead, and runs first-time contribution workshops at the local, regional, and national level. AmyJune is also on the CWG Community Health Team, and she has a magical way of life away from Drupal where she enjoys music festivals and gallivanting in the woods looking for lost treasure. AmyJune, welcome back to the show, and thank you for joining us again.
Thank you for having me back.
I'm Nick Laughlin, and today my co-hosts are John Bicozzi.
You are Nick Laughlin, and I am John Bicozzi. Hello, internet folk.
And also joining us for the third time is Donna Bungard. Welcome.
Hey there.
Okay, we do have a new module of the week. The module of the week this week is only one. John, why don't you tell us about this Highlander module?
I know, seriously. So it's like there can be only one. So the only one module allows you to limit a content type to only create one instance. So my use case for this was that a client needed kind of like an interstitial page to guide people to go one place or another. And I was looking to see if there was a way, if I created a content type without having to build my own kind of module to govern it, to prevent more than one instance of that page to be created. So it's the only one module, pretty basic, but it also has a multilingual aspect to it too. So you can create one node basically of that content type per language. So that's a nice feature, because obviously you would want to translate that page if you were doing a multilingual site. So pretty useful. Doesn't require a bunch of coding. Now our module can just require that, use it, and then we can move on to doing other things with that created content type.
I'm curious about the user experience there. Does it just remove the add option once one's been created, or does it just direct you to that one that's been edited?
So it has some configuration to it where you can set kind of what the add option is, but I think by default it can do one of two things. It can take you to that page when you click the add option, or there's an option, I think, in the settings to take you to the edit page for that added content type. So it is, it's not perfect, but it does basically work with, the add option to say like, oh, nope, already exists. Go edit it here, or, hey, here's the page. So that is helpful.
Very cool. I usually just handle it by having a view that only shows the most recent one. I mean, that still has a little bit of complication, because if they add them and then they edit an older one, they might be like, hey, why isn't my content showing up? But usually I just handle it on the training side. But this module might, enforcing that might make it a little bit nicer for users.
Yeah, so that's typically like, I will do that if there's a need for like history, right? Other than revision history, like if you had different versions of something like a promotion or something like that. But this is very specific to like really only needing one per site. So
sounds good. Okay, moving on to our primary topic. Let's start with the softball. AmyJune, what is opensource.com?
So opensource.com is a website, for the easy answer, right? But it's really a publication that focuses on open source, open culture, and open practice. So what that means is it can be hardware or software, it can be projects. It's really a publication to, kind of promote open source. If you look at the logo, it's a dandelion. So it's like spreading the seeds of open source, sort of one article at a time. That's sort of the high level of what opensource.com is.
Very cool.
Interesting. So what types of content can people find on opensource.com? Is it just articles? Is it videos? Is it tutorials?
That is a great question. It's a lot of articles, but we also publish ebooks and we publish cheat sheets. Most of our popular articles, of course, are on Linux and open source alternatives to proprietary software. Some really popular topics are things like Linux, Git, Python, C+, any programming language tutorials. Raspberry Pi is a big winner for our fans. But folks love articles about projects and what solutions the projects can bring them. They like pragmatic articles where they leave with something new, like a tutorial or a how-to.
I actually saw, as I was researching and perusing opensource.com, you also have a cheat sheet section, which I thought was pretty interesting because I don't know about everybody else, but I love a good cheat sheet. So yeah, a lot of different types of content there at opensource.com, which is great.
Yeah, that's awesome. It sounds almost like the hallway track of a conference, while just online. So really that's awesome. So you're a Red Hatter now. How is Red Hat supporting opensource.com?
So I like to say we're a little bit Red Hat adjacent because, but opensource.com's been around, I think, since about 2010, maybe a little bit earlier than that. And how it started was the CEO at the time, Jim Whitehurst, really wanted to explain that opensource.com wasn't a site about Red Hat or for Red Hat. It was more about open source and the future of open source. So it's really one of the ways that Red Hat contributes back, that form of corporate citizenship that we talk about when we talk about Drupal contributions too. So even though we're Red Hat and I get my paycheck from Red Hat, what's said on opensource.com is the message is from the author, not from their employer or from Red Hat. We really strive to be vendor neutral on the publication.
So I'm curious, has the IBM acquisition introduced any changes either, or is that?
I don't believe so. That was before my time, but from what I understand from the team, opensource.com has its way of running things, which is unique to Red Hat culture because we are vendor neutral and we've always been given that grace.
Okay.
Well, hold on a second. Can we take a step back there for a minute? IBM acquisition, Nick, can you go into a little bit more detail about that?
Yeah, IBM bought Red Hat
2 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Really? Oh, I totally missed that. Totally missed that.
I was at a camp
2019.
that happened. Yeah.
Oh, all right.
$34 billion. So
as per the usual, I'm late to the game. Cool.
There's been nothing going on since then. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Got it. So I guess I'm stuck with some of the obvious questions this show. Is opensource.com an open source project?
No, it's not. So opensource.com is not an open source project in itself, if we're talking about the website. But if you're talking about the community aspect and the sharing of knowledge, then yes, opensource.com is an open source knowledge sharing community. But we don't have an open code base. But everything on our site follows Creative Commons. So you can reuse the material and the pictures and all that kind of stuff because it's under a Creative Commons license. But the website itself is not open source.
So in the spirit, go ahead, Nick.
Is there a plan to open source that at some point, or no? Interesting.
So in the spirit of open source, it sounds like anybody can contribute or be involved with opensource.com. Is that accurate?
Yes, we do welcome all open source practitioners. Again, we do attempt to stay vendor neutral, though. We want folks who contribute to share their passions and write about what interests them. We appreciate articles that are positive rather than articles that shame other vendors or services. We don't ever want to publish an article that insults a product or organization. And then there are topics we kind of shy away from. And I know this isn't quite what you asked, but one example would be security. You know, we tend to shy away from articles on security because we don't want to present information as being secure or not secure. But we can discuss security as a spectrum in relation to something else. But really, we invite all people who have an open source project to contribute.
It's funny, you just said something and it made me think, like, why would somebody write something like that? You know, an article about, you know, just not loving a service or negative towards a service or technology. And I'm just kind of like, I don't know that's helpful. It sounds like you guys are trying to be helpful to folks, right? As opposed to being like opinionated, which I think is, if I'm hearing you right, it sounds like more on the like educational side of things, as opposed to like, here's our opinion on all of this stuff, which is great.
I'll give a little bit of example of that is like we work in the Drupal community, and we have people ask us all the time, what's better, Drupal or WordPress? So we don't want like an article that like, this is Drupal and this is fantastic and WordPress sucks, but we take an article that compares the two in a neutral kind of way. So you can do comparisons, but we don't want that shaming aspect.
Yeah, makes sense.
There's a place for everything, and maybe not right there for everything.
Right.
So I was actually going to ask what made a good article. Like, we're kind of talking about this already, so no shaming, but what are the other aspects?
So I mentioned it before, our readers really like pragmatic articles where they leave learning something new, like a tutorial or a how-to. But with saying that, our persona, our reader persona is not only technical, but not technical. So we do have articles on the same subject, but maybe through a different lens. Not everyone uses project or software in the same way. So it's always nice to have multiple articles on the same subject. For more complex articles, we do provide an article to introduce the subject or project, because sometimes if we have a really complex article that introduces complex concepts, we don't want the novice to be left out. So we have a technical writer that will kind of write an article introducing the concept or idea.
Interesting.
And then sometimes folks will submit articles that fall outside of our scope. But we do have 3 other community sites on Red Hat where they might fit, and we might funnel the content through those. And those 3 sites are Enable Sysadmin, Enable Architect, and the Enterprisers Project. And it's really a lot easier to submit and get an article published than people think. If it's within those open source principles and presents a topic in a neutral manner, they're usually good to go. We have an editorial process that's really user friendly. It goes through a tech review to ensure that, all the steps are followed. If you provide a command, is it the command that works? And then we have it go through copy edit. So, it kind of changes the tone to match our voice. We don't scrape a contributor's voice, but we do make sure that we have a common voice at opensource.com. And then we have guidelines about word count, but they're really loose. If an article's too short, we might ask for more. If an article's too long, we might split it into 2 or propose a series. So really the bottom line is it open source? There are some caveats to that, because say you have an open source project, but it relies on a proprietary aspect, like you need to run something that's proprietary to run your project, that might not be a good fit. And one good example for that is Docker Desktop. So if your project relies on Docker Desktop, it's not really an open source project. But if you can run it on something else as a Docker alternative, we might take out the Docker Desktop and make it more neutral and make people understand that they can use a different kind of container.
So just as an example to that point, right? So if somebody had written an article, right, a how-to, for example, and they'd used Lando, right, which runs on Docker, right? Would the suggestion or the recommendation be to like switch it to like, I don't know, DDev or something that doesn't necessarily use Docker?
So we wouldn't suggest that a person who wants to write about Lando move to DDev, but we might not publish an article on Lando. But like DDev, we can publish because you can use Kalima, the open source alternative to Docker Desktop. But if someone out there in the Lando space can explain how you can use an open source alternative to Docker Desktop, then it would be okay.
Right. Yeah, and I wonder about Lando specifically on Linux, because it doesn't require the proprietary version of Docker. I mean, if I were to write an article in Lando, I'm not using Docker Desktop. I just use native Docker. Right. So I presume that would be fine. I'm curious about something a little bit more specific. Maybe we're going down some example rabbit holes, but it's interesting to me. We talked briefly about how the podcast is mostly open source, like the tool chain. I wonder about something like that, where there's a step or two that maybe you could drop out, but aren't open source, or something like, we post the podcast on YouTube, for example, which is not open source, but that's, you might not be putting it on YouTube. Is that something that would be interesting,
right?
Or acceptable to the site?
So an example article for Talking Drupal might be how we use Video Ninja to record our podcast.
Okay.
Like a case study for Talking Drupal on the open source project that you used to record. It wouldn't be this is the whole process of a podcast, but this is the one aspect, and this is how we use this product, and why we switched from Zoom, which you recently did, why we switched from Zoom to, and you're not cutting Zoom, right? Because the idea of opensource.com is promoting open source and open source alternatives to proprietary software. As long as you're not like bashing Zoom, but this is the alternative we used. And it would be more about that aspect of it versus the whole workflow. So a headline might be why we switched to Video Ninja from Zoom. There's different ways you can architect an article, from looking at it from different lenses.
Yeah, so it's really just about why you're making the choices and how this is good. This is a good fit, and less about any of the rest.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then maybe
leave that opinion out, right?
Right. And then maybe a short tutorial of how do you set it up on your Linux desktop or something like that. I'm not technical, so I'm not sure if that article headline makes sense, but
I can see it now. Open source podcasting, your guide to open source podcasting, sold.
And it sounds like you could do a series for the different pieces. So you wouldn't want an article that says, here's A to Z. First we do this, then this, and this. But you want shorter articles that talk about, like, here's how we use OBS. Here's how we use Video Ninja.
Exactly.
Here's how we, et cetera. Interesting.
Here's how we make John Picozzi look smart on a weekly basis. Sometimes we hit and sometimes we miss. So I don't know if this is a spoiler alert or a look into the future. We were just talking about what makes good articles. I actually was reading an article a couple of weeks ago about progressive web apps, and reached out to AmyJune and was like, hey, can you put me in contact with the author of that post? Because I'd love for him to come on and talk to us. So that show is coming, listeners. Progressive web apps.
That's Drupal. Alex from Moonraft. Yeah. And I want to use that as an example real quick about content that fits. That's a good example. So some folks really, really enjoyed that article. They found it very useful, where other people are like, what is a progressive web app? So we're going back and it's that complex article I talked about where we need to add an introduction article about what is a progressive web app and have that introduction, because some folks got a little lost in the weeds where other people already had that background information, so we did publish that. And then we're listening to the feedback of our audience. And then now we're going to solicit an article about just the basics of, PWAs.
Which is awesome, because it sounds like the process is really really helpful to the authors as well, and it even makes it feel like maybe I could write an article with the technical review and the grammatical review and all that sort of stuff. But we'll see. One question, this kind of goes with the whole like author, I'm wondering, are contributors compensated, financially or otherwise for providing their content?
Typically, no.
Okay.
But we do have programs for repeat authors that include swag and bonus things.
Oh, cool.
I have a contributor club where if you've written 3 articles in a month, you get some swag. And then we have a larger program called the correspondence program, where if you've written, and there's different ways you can get into it, but basically if you've written 10 articles in a year, and we're always changing what the parameters are to get into the correspondence program. But the correspondence program, we offer them like extra nurturing. We provide them like with weekly meetings where we talk about what our authors are or what our audience is looking for. So we provide them with extra assistance with headlines, and maybe, when
That's awesome.
articles come in for review, they kind of go to the top of the queue because we already know and respect, their writing styles and that kind of thing.
Sure.
And then throughout the year, we do different little extended meetups to kind of celebrate each other,
Man, air high five to anybody that can write 3 articles a month. Like I that's awesome, because I, am still writing the same blog post about DrupalCon for my own blog from 4 months ago. So more power to you.
When I first started, I started a few articles and they're still in revisions, and that's been since December. So I hear you.
So how large is the open source community?
Opensource.com. So if you look at the website community, there are, I think we pulled the numbers yesterday, something close to 78,000 active accounts in good standing on opensource.com.
Oh, wow.
We just did a platform change, and then we just did a Drupal 7 to Drupal 9 migration. And so we were hit with some bots. And so we had to weed through and pull out some of these bot created accounts, but we've done that, and we're thinking it's around 78,000.
Wow.
But the authors, we've had over 2,300 individual authors contribute since 2010. And then opensource.com does have around 2 million page views a month with 1.4 million unique visitors a month. And you don't have to have an account to view, of course, but there's a lot of people who, participate, and there's a lot of people who just view.
Yeah. Interesting. I guess that makes me think, because, my slip of the tongue there when I said open source, I guess one of the questions is, are there other projects like opensource.com that try to build a larger community of open source contributors, I guess?
There's a lot of them out there, with the starting of like community management and developer advocacy roles and stuff like that. So you have a lot of communities, I think, kind of getting built right now and running on that community manager sort of thing. So that I think they're becoming more formalized. I've seen a lot more, and maybe because I'm in the field now and I network with other community managers, I see an uprise in more communities being built. Yeah.
Interesting.
So outside of kind of the perks that we just talked about for folks, and as far as compensation goes, what are some of the other benefits, or why would somebody want to contribute to opensource.com, do you think?
So why would someone want to contribute? Well, knowledge sharing, for one. It feels really good. Well, to me, it feels really good to educate other people. And also, as we educate other people, we learn in the process of teaching, right? Mm-hmm. But much like, I've been on here before where I talked about why do we mentor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why do we speak at conferences? And it really comes down to those same principles of, it can really build your street cred. It can help build your personal brand. Opensource.com is seen as a very reputable publication, so adding it to your resume, say you're trying to get a job as a technical writer or something like that, and maybe you're not contributing in a forward-facing way to an open source project, but you've contributed to our publication, and again, opensource.com does get, around 2 million page views a month. Will a specific article get that many page views? No. but they'll get more page views than maybe if the article was just published on their personal site or a platform like LinkedIn or Medium. And so if you have a project you want to elevate and promote and want people to learn about, then, there's definitely going to be more eyes on opensource.com.
So that actually raises a question for me. Do you guys allow for like cross posting? So if somebody posted to their blog and then it was really good, could they cross post to open source?
Yes, we've done that a couple of times in just in the Drupal space since I've worked here at opensource.com. But there are a little bit of rules and caveats around that.
Sure.
We don't want a lot of backlinks. Like we don't want it to be promoting the company. But if you've written an article about something that's going to educate, we will send that copy like we would if someone submitted an article, send it to copy editing and have them do a spin on it. But then we also don't want to be like dinged because of duplicate content, like when Google crawls it, right? So we switch it up enough where it's presented maybe in a newer or fresher way. Or if it's something that wasn't evergreen, we make it evergreen. But then we always give attribution at the bottom that says a version of this was originally posted at X, Y, and Z.
Okay.
Cool.
And then also, like, say someone submits an article that was published before, they're like, I have this article, so use this as sort of the premise as the bullet points, but can you add these sort of things in, and we'll work with an article with an author to get that article a little bit snazzier or from a different point of view or something like that. But yeah, republications is good. I've done that because like Jonathan Daggerhart wrote an article about Composer, and I've been mentoring, and I always reference that article. So I thought, this is a really great article to have on opensource.com. So I asked him if he would allow us to republish it. And I did, and so that's always something like the team always does. If we're always referencing an article from someplace else, why not add it to our site for more eyes?
Makes sense.
So
Interesting.
we've talked a lot about like the author's experiences and the user experiences. What about yours? What's it like to do that community manager role?
So it's a lot different. Well, not like a whole lot different than what I did at Canopy, right? Canopy paid me to like give back to open source, and I did a lot of things that were sort of in that management lead kind of role. But now it's more like I don't write, I don't contribute, I do on the side, but not for my role at opensource.com. I manage the people, I'm the people person. We're a small editorial team. There's only 3 of us beyond, we have copy editors and that sort of thing, but the editorial team is me, the editorial manager, and the technical review manager. So I manage the people part of it. We talked about, the extended contributors, so I manage the correspondence program, where we meet virtually and talk about projects we've discovered, new tech, what we ate for breakfast, whatever. I manage a writer's list where I create prompts and headlines, which I send out weekly to authors that have opted in for this weekly list. And it's an email in the form of a forum. So I manage the discussions. And then if someone presents a really good topic from the headline, we'll ask them and we'll work with them to create an article around it. But, like last week I asked, because I'm really into music, I asked, what are people using to collect their music? What are people using to edit their files or manage their files and that kind of thing? And so we've had 20 people post on that. And I might take that and make it into like a short article where I talk about what everyone's using or what everyone's listening to, but I kind of facilitate those discussions. I nurture new writers along with the existing writers. The one job I really don't like that I do, one of my tasks is I manage the email for opensource.com. And that email address has been on the web since 2010. So you can imagine what my inbox looks like in the morning. But I cull through those for article submissions and communications. I pull article submissions off of theirs and I put them on the review board. And then I manage the relationships from there, from the submission process to the publication process. I still attend conferences, I build my networks through the social media sites. I have been actively trying to diversify the voices and the folks who write for opensource.com. So I've been reaching out to excluded communities. And then I'm also looking to diversify the topics we publish. Just because there's not a lot of articles on Drupal or accessibility doesn't mean we aren't taking articles on that. So I'm taking some of my passions and reaching out to people in my networks to bring more topics into opensource.com. And let's talk about that like dandelion logo again. It's that vessel for spreading seeds. We can do that organically with the wind, as the wind blows across your dandelion field, but we can also blow the seeds in the direction where you'd like them to go. And I'm really working on that part of it, but the diversification of topics and voices.
I honestly just had a visual of AmyJune running through a field with a straw, like blowing seeds, and they need to go this way.
I love dandelions. Let me just say that I try to spread them everywhere I can.
Yeah, I like them. Like I have a lawn, but I have a gardener who pulls them. So I love them, but I also don't have to take care of the lawn. And then there's a couple other things that I'm working on currently since I've started. I have been doing a speaker workshop in the community over the last few years in the WordPress and the Drupal space, where it's a speaker workshop. Well, I've converted that into a writer's workshop, so I can kind of take that onto the road and present people who might be nervous or don't know what to write about. I'm really excited
Bring
about
down those barriers, basically breaking down those barriers.
Exactly. And then, I manage some partnerships with companies or marketing people just because that's the nature of who submits articles to.
So I have to ask, because you're a community manager, have you ever read People Power by John O'Bacon?
No, I haven't.
It's been so long
since
John has plugged that book.
Hey, listen, it's a great book. And
not denying it.
I recommend it highly, especially for, people that are doing what AmyJune's doing. So, anyway, we'll put a link in the show notes. It was episode 265 if anybody's interested. And
what's the author's name?
John O'Bacon.
It's in my Goodreads if you want to check it out.
Which, literally the best last name going. Anyway.
So you mentioned that opensource.com recently went through migration from Drupal 7 to Drupal 9. I'm curious about how opensource.com uses Drupal. Is the editorial process completely on the site? Is it, you mentioned some submissions come by email.
Right.
How is it used?
So submissions do come from email because it goes through the copy editing phase, and it's just easier to have that sort of back and forth with the author when it's in a doc that you can share, right? Rather than a Drupal instance. And we don't want to open up permissions to non-published sites, to authors that are just kind of random, right? So Red Hat uses Drupal for most of their forward-facing sites, most of them. And then opensource.com and the other 3 community sites I mentioned, we use Drupal for content delivery and analytics. And some of the folks use it to kind of manage the people, but I use an external CRM because it's just easier. So once we finalize and discover that we want to publish an article, then we have copy editors. And when they're done, they do all the editorial or the content entry on Drupal.
Oh, okay.
And then we have certain processes like scheduling and preview links and things like that. And we've just, I think in the last 2 months, have the Drupal 9 instance. So we're still working on some of the editorial workflow.
Okay. Pretty cool.
Just out of curiosity, why was Drupal chosen for the website? I mean, there are plenty of other CMS-y things out there. What sent you towards Drupal?
I had to ask someone on my team because of, obviously it was before my time. And so Jason Hibbets gave me some historical content on this, is that their first requirement was that the platform, of course, be open source.
Sure.
That's the obvious thing. And back when they were first looking at it in 2009, there were lots of options. I think he mentioned WordPress, Plone, Drupal, and there was another one I can't remember. But based on the requirements that the site needed, the dynamic content and user privileges, and our correspondents used to have more of a workflow. They used to moderate comments and things like that. They used to help more on the site. So with those requirements, they narrowed it down to Drupal and WordPress. And that hinging factor really was that they wanted to build community. And so Drupal was just a better fit to accomplish that goal. Once they figured out what they wanted, they started to search for an agency to help. But it wasn't agency influenced, but they kind of got that, like, why would we go with one CMS versus the other? And so they had Palantir help them do the first revision of the site on Drupal 6. And now we're on Drupal 9.
Wow. Long time Drupal there. Drupal 6. I mean, that's quite
ancient history.
Quite the commitment. That's awesome.
Yep.
Very cool. All right. Well, we all know I have a love affair with words here. So I want to go back to the articles. What is the life cycle of that? What is, how long does it take for a new contributor to, like, hey, AmyJune, I want to publish this, go through the process, get it published, yada, yada, yada.
Okay, so there's a couple of different scenarios there. There's the scenario of, hey, I have this idea. That process is going to take a little bit longer, right? Because it's like, oh, okay, like here's a couple of headlines I'm thinking about. Is it worth me writing? And that's kind of hard to manage. So we'll write them back and say, like, okay, so these are the headlines, and the headlines look to fit, but maybe you can include some bullet points about what you're going to write about, And so that takes a little bit longer. So we're going to put that scenario aside. Say we have a person like you, Donna, you have your article written, it's open source, you are submitting for the first time, you go through the process, it's on the website, but usually people just email opensource.com or me directly and attach their article either with like a Google Doc or some kind of file. And I say, looks great, Donna, I am going to submit this to the team for review. So it goes on to like a board where there's a review process where the technical manager will review and make sure that it's a good fit for us. There might be a little bit of back and forth about, hey, you went this direction, but can you talk about this a little bit more? Or can we reorganize a little bit? So that takes a few days, it might take a couple of days for the review, for the review to get the article to get reviewed, and then maybe another day for the technical review. And I send it back because I want to make sure that it's in a good place for you, right? I don't want you to be totally surprised when it gets spit back out. So once that happens, it goes to copy editing, and then it usually hangs out in copy editing for a couple of weeks, gets back from copy editing. Our SEO people do a little bit of magic on it. We make sure that the tone and the voice works, and then I will send you a link for you to review. Depending on how long it takes for you to get back to me, you might have some edits, you might have no edits. So generally, the process takes about 3 weeks for that first time contributor.
Okay. Oh, wow.
Okay.
That's really fast.
That's, as I said, that's a quicker turnaround than I've seen.
That's generally, because there are those other cases where you don't write back to me in a reasonable amount of time, or there's so many edits that you're like, oh, let me start again. Or maybe the technical review might have that component of there's this one aspect that's proprietary. Let's think of a way that we can make this whole article about open source. Yeah. So, but the best case scenario is that 2 to 3 weeks, and that's just like mostly because that this is a good fit, right?
Yeah. And I can, I've been published before, and I know that process took a lot longer than that, but a lot of it was me, because when I got the feedback, I just needed to sit with it. And sometimes an author does, and that's going to, frankly, make it a lot harder for you guys.
Yeah, and that's why we do that first round of review in the docs versus on the Drupal instance, so that way there can be discussion and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But a lot of times people will not submit the best thing. Not a lot of times. Sometimes people will submit not the best thing in the world, but we do some magic and they're really pleased with the outcome. They're like, wow, you took those bullet points or those chicken scratches and you made this like wonderful article, right? So there's been a couple of times since I've worked there where we've had an article where we've had to remove some voice, and there's been like, we don't promise to publish every submission. We just don't, right? You know, even if it is a good fit for opensource.com, it might not be for a weird reason, right?
Well, the voice, the opinion, if it can't be separated, if we can't separate the egg from the yolk, maybe it's
right.
Yeah,
and then
not the best thing for the pancake.
And since I've worked there, I've only had one author be like, I don't like any of the changes you made. I'm not gonna pursue it, you know, but most of the people are pretty happy about the review process.
Awesome.
So do you guys test all the articles that come in? Like if there's a cheat sheet or there's like a process?
Yep. Seth does that. And that's why it takes a couple of days at that first, because he will test every command. He'll make sure it works. And then he doesn't know everything. So he has to actually like learn some stuff, and he has to make sure that everything works. And so he loves his job because he learns something new every time he reviews an article. You know, it's like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. But yeah, there is a review process where he makes sure that all of it works, that it is vendor neutral, that the anticipated results come out, especially on those how-to tutorials, right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's super.
And it probably
super
also
important.
It probably also helps a lot with the editing, because if he can't figure it out, then somebody else probably will have the same issue. So it helps kind of flesh out.
Exactly. And if it's a real complicated article, you know, he will become the people person then and work with them to do the technical stuff, because I lose stuff in translation because that's not my job, right? I don't have to be technical. So we'll move it to him, and he'll work with the author to make sure everything's correct, because we do want to remain that reputable source of information for opensource.com. And really, some of those like really heavy technical articles might not be a good fit for our site, so they go to those other sites like sysadmin or enable architect, you know. So but he's also the reviewer for those too.
Nobody ever promotes the tutorial that didn't work or that was hard to follow, right? They're not like, hey, check this really crappy tutorial out.
Right.
So, you know, we're obviously, you know, working in open source. Open source is technology. Technology moves very quickly. How do you guys handle outdated articles? You talked a little bit about like trying to make sure an article's like evergreen, but like I'm assuming certain things, you know, certain open source projects get discontinued, get changed. How do you guys manage that? Is there some sort of flag, or do you just pull the article down?
No. So that is hard to manage. We do not go back necessarily and check every single article to make sure that it's up to date, but there are dates on the article. And you know what I mean? And so I trust that a reader can look at the 2017 date and assume there may have been updates since then. But if it's something bigger, we will have an article in the future that someone says like, oh, I wrote this article about, you know, this video processing software. Here's the new stuff that I use for this video processing software, you know, and then there'll be a link back. And then, you know, I do find some articles from time to time that are about like conferences that are coming up and there's dates on there. Well, we'll go back and we'll fix that because that isn't relevant anymore. But as far as like the outdated information, I really trust that the authors or the readers will see that date.
Makes sense.
And it's true, because some technology will go from open source into proprietary and then back into open source again, you know, so that can be tricky. But we publish, you know, 1 to 2 articles a day. So that's a lot of articles to review.
Is there a goal or a limit there, or is that just what it happens to be?
That's just what happens.
Okay, that makes sense. Kind of organic growth.
Yeah, and, you know, say like, you know, we have some PTO coming up, you know, so we're going to do 1 article for a couple of days because our editor's away, and you know what I mean, that kind of thing. We really like have a whole lot of things that contribute to that 1 or 2 articles a day, but we typically don't go over 2 articles a day. But that's just the way it is too. We always seem to have enough that comes in, and then Seth, our technical review person is also a writer. And so he writes prolifically. You know, if he's reading an article and there's something he wants to learn more about, he'll write an article about it. And then we'll do things like the cheat sheets, or we'll do things like, where I call out like, hey, what's your favorite get command? And we'll have some like community-based articles where everyone writes a paragraph about their favorite get command, so we can kind of fill in those gaps if there's a lull in submissions. And then we'll publish ebooks where we take, articles on the same content and kind of book them together for people. And that way they can have an easy access to like the same kind of topic.
When people say get blame, do you not publish that one? Cause it's.
No, that was in an article recently. Yeah.
I just want to know if get reflog has ever been talked about, because that's one of the most powerful commands that Git has, but it's also probably the most complicated command that Git has.
So back in April, I did a writers list, and I did a call on you on Twitter, and then I asked all my Drupal friends, because I want my Drupal friends to be published too, right? So I'm like, hey, here's this easy prompt, like, what's your favorite get command, or how do you use this? And I believe that was in one of the 3 articles that got published back in April.
I'll have to check.
Yeah.
And for our listeners, for our listeners, get blame will tell you who made a change somewhere. Not necessarily to blame somebody, but it's just like, this user is the one that made the change. And get reflog, basically you can undo rebases with it, I guess, is a way to like, that's the only time I've ever had to use it, but it's a way to like point to not like an old branch, but like an old version of the Git repository as a whole. It's a very complicated command. I've only used it a couple of times, but I'd love to see how somebody approached that, because it's really tangled. Well, as we wrap up, thank you for joining us again, AmyJune. It's been great hearing about opensource.com. I definitely had a couple of ideas for some short articles as we've been talking, and I'm sure our listeners kind of heard the light bulb go off a couple of times. But before we wrap up, is there anything else you would like to share? Are there any articles you'd like our listeners to write?
Well, Dries, you had asked me if you could write an article for opensource.com when we were at DrupalCon, and I haven't seen that yet, so I'm going to call out Dries right now. But I want to really iterate that it's a lot easier than folks think. Say you are a speaker and you're used to speaking at conferences. Well, turn that talk into an article. We have people that will help, but again, I just want to stress that the process is so much easier than people envision. It's a lot easier to get published. And I would love to see more articles about Drupal, like case studies about how you use Drupal. What are some of your favorite open source modules? What solution do they provide? That kind of thing. And then also, I'm into music. And so there's a lot of new music projects out there, how to label your files, what solutions are you using, how are you using something on Linux, that kind of thing. And so those are my personal preferences. Like, I want to hear more about how people use open source, because I've been in open source for a while, but I haven't been necessarily using all open source projects until recently, So for me, it's a learning process about what do people do and how does it work, And so music is a passion, Drupal is a passion, things like that.
It's interesting. I appreciate the fact that you think that Dries listens to our show. That really means a lot to me. But as we have been talking, I've been thinking about my DrupalCon talk about non-code contribution, and we just turned it into a blog post for the internal EPAM blog. But maybe I will do what you have said and drop it into an email and send it your way.
Yeah. And, we have had articles on that topic, but we always welcome new articles because it's a different lens. And you're talking about Drupal versus someone else who's talking about like open source projects in general, so just because it has been published doesn't mean it's not good content, because your content will be different and from a different lens and scope.
I'm enlightened.
And I'd love to see more articles about accessibility testing tools that are open source and how people are using open source to test their websites for accessibility. That is content that is absent from our site right now.
We just had a show about that, so that would definitely be something that we could get you in contact with some folks about. Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or via email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts, other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel. If you're interested in show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and Chad's Book Corner, sign up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
And thank you, patrons, for your support of Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and clicking that Become a Patron button in the sidebar.
Well, as we wrap up, thank you again, AmyJune, for joining us. If our listeners wanted to get in touch with you, what would be the best way?
So if folks want to submit an article or ask me about how or what or anything they want to ask me about opensource.com, they can write to that email I talked about, open@opensource.com. And I do check that every day. But I am Volkswagen Chick across all of the spaces, Twitter and LinkedIn. And that's always a good way to reach out to me as well.
And Donna, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
I'm on all the socials and Drupal Slack as either D Bungard or Donna Bungard. Just look me up. I'm pretty much anywhere.
Awesome. And John, how about you?
You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi, and you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at NixVan, NICXVAN.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. Have a good one, everyone.
See you guys next week.
Bye.